Hey class, so for this exercise we are going to be extruding the word extrude. It's a simple exercise that's going to give you a lot of practice on moving pivot point. We're going to use our different snap tools, and then we're going to be using the extrude tool. Let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is demonstrate the pivot point, the different snap tools, and extrude. So I'm going to create a cube. I'm going to scale it up. And actually, I'm going to factor it at a scale of, let's say, 4. And I can change that easily in my channel box layer editor. I'm also going to turn on my wireframe on shaded so you guys can see what I'm working on here. And then let's take a look at our pivot point. So you'll notice whenever we've been selecting using the manipulator tool, at the very center of our object is where all of our transformations have been occurring. Except for the case where sometimes our pivot point got moved and we recentered it using this center pivot point button. But we can also manually move the pivot point whenever we like or wherever we like. So that's what we're going to be doing here, where we're going to move it to the bottom of our sphere. So to move your pivot point, it's best to have your move tool activated, and then you're just going to press and hold the D key while moving this around. Now you can see I already have one of my snap tools on, so that was grid snap. So let's just see what grid snap does. So I'm going to turn grid snap on by clicking on it, press and hold D, and now you can see when I move this around, it's snapping to the grid. So that's grid snap. The next one is snap to curves. So if I turn that on, and I barely ever use this one, by the way. If I hold down D, and this time I'm going to move using my Move Multi-Ways tool, it really doesn't actually snap to anything on my model, and that's because these are edges and not curves. So a curve would be an object that we would make out here. So we don't really use this one. Our next option would be snap to points. So with snap to points, I can hold down D again. And actually, I'm going to center this before I do anything. Snap to points, I'm going to hold down D and use my arrow key, and this is going to drag it up. And this is snapping it to the same level as all these other vertices at the top of my object. Press D again, move it down so it's actually in line with the vertices at the bottom of my object. Because I've been holding the arrows or using the arrows, it's snapping just straight up and down. But if I wanted to press D and click the center of this object so I can move it anyway, I can snap it precisely to these edge points, these vertices. So for the purpose of this exercise, I just want to snap it to the bottom of my model and keep it in the center point. So I'm just going to press D, use my green arrow, and snap it all the way down. And then I'm going to move my whole model so it's sitting on my grid. So I'm going to turn on grid snap and just move my model now up. And you can see it's nice and flat with my origin point. So to extrude an object, or an extrusion, is the process used to create objects of fixed cross-sectional profiles by pushing material through a die. So what you're most familiar with is Play-Doh and their extrusion processes. Also used in creating spaghetti, pipes, any of those kind of things where you push a material through a set die. So that's extrusion in real life. Let's look at it in Maya. Okay, so we're going to go back to our model and select by faces because we're going to be extruding just the faces in here. So I'm going to select this front face or top face and the bottom face. And you can select or choose to extrude by going to Edit Mesh and Extrude. And you can see the shortcut here is Command E or probably Control E on a PC. And you can see instantly it's giving me this little pop-up box. This pop-up box is giving me options for my extrusion. So thickness means how thick this extrusion is. It's similar to local Z translate. So sometimes I use local Z, sometimes I use thickness. You can also select offset. So offset is going to change the size of your extrusion. So you can see it's making it smaller, or if I go the opposite direction, it makes it bigger. I can change these values by clicking in the box and typing, or if you use your left mouse button and click and drag left and right over these values, you're going to be able to click and drag to change them. You can also change the number of divisions, so that's adding edge loops between the extrusion and the original faces. And then keep faces together is something we'll talk about later, but basically it's whether you want, if you have two faces that are next to each other and I'm extruding them, so I can also pull here. If I want these faces to be separate objects, I can turn keep faces together off, and you can see now they're extruding separately. Okay, so I'm going to undo that and actually extrude. So I'm going to use my, I'm going to go to the top view, I think. And I'm going to use my grid snap and just snap to two places, or I guess maybe let's do, yeah, two grid places. I'm going to extrude one more time. So Edit Mesh, Extrude. And this time I'm going to do 3 grid places. There you go. So this is making the top of my E. I'm going to grab these 3 faces and I'm going to extrude again. So this time, let's do Edit Mesh and Extrude. So remember, I can pull on this blue arrow, and it's almost always the blue arrow that you want to pull on if you're using Extrude. Or I could use local Z translate. I don't know if I could use thickness. Yes, I could. Okay. There we go. So that is my E. So let's move on to the next one. So I'm going to select by object mode, or I can go into the modeling toolkit and select by object. I'm going to move this E out of the way. And now I'm going to make a cube and start on my X. So same process, I do need to move that pivot point down. So remember, you're going to turn on your point snap, hold down D and click and drag it to the bottom. I'm actually going to scale this up. I remember it was 4. And then I'm going to turn off point snap, turn on grid snap, and just snap to the grid. There we go. And then this will be the center of my X, so I do want to rotate this. Now here's a new tip. If you press E to rotate and then press and hold J when you rotate your model, it will actually snap to 15-degree increments. So I want to rotate it in the Y direction, -45 degrees. And now I can select by faces. So either use your modeling or your marking menu by right-clicking over your model and selecting by faces, or using the modeling toolkit. And let's just select all of these faces. I'm gonna use my select tool. And then we're going to extrude. So Edit Mesh and Extrude, or use the shortcut. Instantly it is creating this tool that I can use. I'm going to click and drag it out. I still have grid snap on, so it's snapping me to I think 4. And then here's the case where you want to turn off keep faces together. So I'm just going to click and drag left. And I have my X. All right, select by object again, and let's move these two off. Now you'll see an interesting thing happens because I have grid snap turned on. They collapse into each other and try and snap to the grid. So I'm just going to move them that way and then move this one over and down. There we go. But I could also just turn off grid snap and move them normally as well. All right, I'm going to speed up the rest of these letters, but I want you to make the full word. And for each of these, I'm just always going to be scaling them up, moving the pivot point down. So remember that's D, using the snap. And then really it's just up to you to try and figure out how to make these letters. And it's okay. It's literally just an exercise for you to get comfortable moving around, extruding, moving the pivot point, and using your grid snap. So it's cool however your letters turn out. Don't worry too much about it. Mine are a little odd at times for sure. But we're not going to be rendering this or anything. It's literally just a fun little exercise to get you going with Extrude. Oh, and the other thing that you're really practicing too is changing between selecting between faces, selecting objects, and all that good stuff. So use this as practice, and you can see even I forget to move my pivot points from time to time, so I'm just moving them back up and moving them so they're all on the same level. And then the last E is actually the hardest. It took me a little bit of thinking to figure it out. And you can always just select by faces and move them in and out. And I also do some adjustments with the vertices later as well. So it's up to you. Just have fun with it. And when you're done, submit a screenshot. All right, and let me know if you have any questions. Have a good one.